There are some in the world of politics here in New Hampshire who survey the primary field every 4 years and say there are too many candidates. Well, that's not us. We always like to meet and question the people who come from around the country to put themselves to the test of the New Hampshire voters. Former clandestine CIA officer and Congressman Will Hurd is the latest to join the Republican primary, and he's our guest this morning on Close Up. Thanks for being here.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So we want to start off, with that big question in terms of what path do you see for yourself to the White House? Because you really are kind of starting from scratch here.
Sure. And look, I recognize I'm a dark horse candidate, but here's the reality. People want something different. When 6 out of 10 voters do not want to see Donald Trump on the ballot and 7 out of 10 do not want to see Joe Biden, they want to see more options. And I'm of the opinion that options are better. This is the United States of America. We became a great nation because of a competition of ideas. And there are only 23% of Americans that actually vote in primaries. And if any dark horse candidate had a chance, it's here in the Granite State, because y'all appreciate ideas, y'all appreciate people that are willing to work, and folks here in New Hampshire take their job as first in the nation very seriously.
The parties clearly are manipulating the primary process through the debate access and the thresholds there. It really does winnow the field in terms of people who can get that national level access. Are you going to make it past the threshold, A, and B, how does New Hampshire help you work around that if not?
Well, we're working towards meeting those thresholds, but I've made it very clear I'm not signing a loyalty oath, a loyalty pledge. It would be real easy to lie to voters and do something and have no interest in supporting Donald Trump in the end. I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to lie in order to get access to a microphone. I've taken one oath, and that was to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. I take one pledge. That's when I put my hand on the heart and pledge to the flag of the United States of America. And I've taken one vow. That's to my amazing, beautiful wife, and I'm going to keep it to that.
There are a number of Supreme Court rulings that we could discuss, but I'll toss it to you on this one. Which one of these, of the number of rulings that have come out in the last few days, do you think will have the biggest impact on American life in the years ahead?
Well, I'll talk about the affirmative action one. The reality is this, is that right now our universities are not reflective of our states and our society, and we are not doing enough in high schools to prepare black and brown kids for their future. And that's a problem at states. That's a problem that everybody should care about, and we should be focused on that root cause, is why are our schools not performing well enough to make sure these kids are ready for college and can be successful in college. And this should be even more of a concern at a time when technologies like artificial intelligence are going to upend every industry, not in 10 years, but in 2 and 3 years. And we have to be making sure our kids are ready and our schools aren't cutting it.
What about the student debt ruling? And obviously that initiative from the Biden administration was on shaky legal ground even from the start. But what should the next president do to make higher education more affordable and accessible, as you just mentioned?
Sure. And look, that's another thing. We shouldn't have been surprised by that ruling from the Supreme Court, because even Nancy Pelosi said that Joe Biden didn't have the ability to do that. And shame on Joe Biden for getting the hopes up of millions of kids, thinking that they're going to have a chance to have their loans repaid. But the question I have to ask ourselves is, why is the cost of college education increasing so significantly? The increase in this 21st century has been it's been outrageous how fast it's been increasing. And then two, why are universities and institutions of higher learning producing kids that can't get jobs to pay back their loans? Those are two big issues. And what can the federal government do? We should be looking at these institutions that if you're not producing students properly, then why should you be able to get access to federal funds to use Pell Grants when you're not producing a workforce that can pay back those loans?
You represented the southern border area of Texas in Congress, and you just got a chance to take a trip up to the northern border here on the U.S.-Canada border in New Hampshire. I'm curious about what you saw and learned, what compare and contrast you can offer to what happens in the south. Obviously, it's a little bit more sleepy up there on that Canadian border, but did you see anything that caught your eye or grabbed your attention?
Look, I was thankful for the sheriff in Coos County taking me up there and showing what's happening. And here's what my big takeaway is: when you have sheriffs on the southern border and sheriffs on the northern border saying the same thing, then maybe Department of Homeland Security should listen. And you're right. What we're facing on the southern border is a crisis and it's absolute chaos. You don't have that volume on the northern border, but here's what you are seeing. You're seeing an increase in the number of people coming through our northern borders illegally. It's increased by almost 800% year over year. The amount of fentanyl that is coming through there is pretty significant. And what I saw, what I learned in the southern border, every mile of the southern border is different from every other mile. And seeing that with my own eyes, you realize how porous the northern border is. And one of the differences that the advantages in the northern border is our Canadian partners. We should be sharing more information and intelligence with each other, because the intelligence relationship between the United States and Canada is much more significant and deeper than it is with Mexico. So let's address some of those problems, like additional law enforcement in that part in our northern border, to make sure that these increases that we're seeing don't turn into a crisis itself.
In this Republican primary, former President Trump's legal troubles continue to grow, and yet his lead in the primary continues to grow. What's happening?
Well, here's the thing that I think people aren't talking about when it comes to Donald Trump. People that love him and have voted for him twice recognize that the baggage is continuing to increase, and there's probably going to be other court cases. But the other thing that I've started hearing a little bit is people think he's starting to get a little boring. He's talking about the same things he talked about in 2016. Then it was fresh, then it was new, and now he's talking about and rehashing the things that happened in the past. And what we need is a president who's actually looking forward to the future. How are we going to have a time of unprecedented peace? How are we going to have a thriving economy at a time when inflation is persistent and every industry is going to get impacted by new technologies like artificial intelligence? How do we make sure that we have world-class education for our kids, regardless of their age and location? And this is what voters, whether you're in the North Country, New Hampshire, or West Texas, want to see happen.
I'm curious your perspective on the idea of a Trump pardon. Obviously, you served in the CIA in countries that have probably imprisoned former leaders. That's never happened in the United States. As president, would you pardon former President Trump to ensure that that situation didn't happen here? Or do you believe that justice, once carried out through the courts, must be served?
Nobody's above the law, and you're innocent until proven guilty. So let's see what happens. Some of the information that was in the indictment about the classified information is pretty damning if it is indeed true. And as someone whose responsibility that my colleagues and I were putting ourselves in harm's way in order to protect our nation from threats to our homeland, for someone to be so callous with that information that if it got into the wrong hands could lead to the loss of life. So talking about pardons now is to me incredibly premature. It's probably unlikely if I were to do it, but again, there should be consequences to action. But also something we should be seeing is Department of Justice should be showing a level of transparency that we've never seen from the Department of Justice because of the significance of these cases.
People talk about the former president waving the documents around. I'm interested for your perspective on when no one's around those documents. Those are normally under lock and key. You hear about the secure, the SCIF facilities. If those documents are just sitting there at Mar-a-Lago, that's pretty dangerous.
It's pretty dangerous. Look, there's a broader problem with successive White Houses taking care of classified information. I can tell you, I've never taken a classified document out of a SCIF. That's a secured environment. And some of the things that we haven't heard from Donald Trump, and he hasn't answered, is what has he done to vet his employees and members that are there? Because guess what? Our adversaries, the Russians and the Chinese, they know of wanting to get close to the former president. How else has he been protecting those documents? Secret Service is there to protect him. It's not there to protect his hotels or his residences. And these are some of the questions that Donald Trump hasn't answered. And the men and women, the thousands of men and women, every single day and every single night that are putting themselves in harm's way deserve those answers.
All right. Former Congressman Will Hurd, we'll see you out there on the campaign trail here in New Hampshire.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Appreciate the time.